Imagine growing up in the shadow of Hollywood's brightest lights, in the heart of Los Angeles, yet living in a world devoid of light. A world where children are treated not as human beings, but as inconvenient objects. A world where a baby's first bath is in a tub of filthy water, where a 5-year-old signs a contract pledging his soul for 1 billion years, and where public beatings are a spectacle for other children to witness. This isn't a dystopian novel or a horror film. This was the childhood of Jamie, one of the lost children of Scientology's inner clergy. For over half a century, across 4 continents, a generation of kids born into the church's most devoted ranks suffered systematic neglect, psychological programming, and physical hardship, a story that has remained, until now, largely in the shadows. Their existence was a secret buried under doctrine, their cries for help dismissed as the consequences of their own past life sins. Today, we pull back the curtain. If you're ready to hear a story of unimaginable resilience from within one of the world's most controversial organizations, you're in the right place. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel and have hit that like button. It helps us bring more hidden stories to light. And if you know someone who needs to understand the full picture, please share this video. Our story doesn't begin with grand ceremonies or theological debates. It begins in a place that defies every instinct we have about the care of children, a silent, grim nursery in a slum building on the outskirts of downtown Los Angeles. This was Jamie's first home. On the day he was born in a Westwood medical center, he wasn't taken to a cozy family house. He was driven directly to this ramshackle building in the Rampart district and turned over to members of Scientology's Sea Org, the dedicated inner clergy known as the Inner Navy. For the next 3 years, this peeling, roach-infested office building was his entire world. Think about that for a second. The most formative years of human development, where attachment and touch are critical, were spent in a hellhole, as Jamie describes it. There were no baby pictures, no lullabies, no gentle rocking. Just the stark reality of cribs and the silence of neglect. What does a baby remember? Jamie insists he has memories from this time, not of warmth or comfort, but of sensation and absence. The sensation of sitting in his own sick and feces, for hours, for days. The absence of human touch. The view of a cracked ceiling, a fixed point in an otherwise chaotic and lonely existence. It was a life stripped down to the barest, most brutal necessities. This wasn't an accident of poverty. This was the designed environment for the children of Sea Org members, who were themselves working around the clock for the church. The kids were out of sight, warehoused, because they were not yet useful to the organization's mission. Their basic humanity was an afterthought, a logistical problem to be contained. The horrifying details of this containment were confirmed decades later when a former caretaker reached out to Jamie. She asked if he remembered how they were bathed. He had no memory. She then revealed the chilling routine. Once a week, 3 nannies would line up 30 to 40 babies. A diaper would be removed, the baby dipped into a single bath of water, hastily wiped, and handed to the next nanny for a fresh diaper. Then, without draining the water, the next baby would be placed in the same bath. Let that image sink in. For the first 3 years of his life, Jamie's weekly bath was, by his own words, being dipped in feces. Then, clean diaper secured, he was returned to his crib to sit once more in his own waste. This wasn't just neglect. It was a systematic, ritualized form of degradation that normalized filth and detachment from the earliest possible age. This nursery represents the foundational trauma of the lost children. It established the core lesson their young nervous systems were forced to learn. You are not deserving of care. Your comfort is irrelevant. Your body is not your own. Before they could walk or talk, they were being programmed for a lifetime of obedience and shame. The peeling paint and the scurrying roaches were just the backdrop. The real tragedy was the silent, empty space where love and safety were supposed to be. This was the first chapter in Jamie's life, and for thousands of other children on 4 continents, it was theirs as well. A stark, uniform introduction to a world that viewed them not as kids, but as tiny, inconvenient spirits in need of harsh conditioning. If the nursery broke down the body and senses, the doctrine that followed was designed to reshape the mind. Around the age of 3, as Jamie moved into a militaristic dormitory with hundreds of other children, he was introduced to the core Scientology belief system, not through gentle teaching, but as an immutable law governing his worth and his suffering. The central, mind-bending premise taught to these toddlers was this: you are not a child. You are a trillion-year-old being, a fallen god trapped in a meat body, and Earth is a prison planet. This wasn't metaphorical story time. It was a psychological framework used to justify a complete absence of childhood. Why console a crying 4-year-old who has scraped a knee? According to the doctrine, that child is a timeless spiritual entity who has lived billions of lives. Their pain is not valid. It's a sign of weakness, a negative reaction from their reactive mind. They were expected to act as adults because, in theory, they already were. This belief system created a devastating loop of blame for any hardship. The concept of pulling it in was drilled into them. If something bad happens to you, you must have done something bad in a past life or earlier in this life to deserve it. A broken tooth from a fall, you pulled it in. A severe infection, you pulled it in. This removed any need for the organization or its adult members to express sympathy or provide care. Sympathy was itself considered a harmful act. The result was a child navigating pain, illness, and fear in total emotional isolation, believing on some level that their suffering was their own fault. It was a brilliant, cruel form of psychological control that internalized guilt and prevented them from seeing themselves as victims of neglect. They weren't being mistreated, they were being spiritually cleansed. The expectation of adult-level responsibility collided horrifically with the reality of their deprivation. Jamie recalls being handed tasks with the assumption he could perform them like a grown-up, because he was a trillion-year-old being who simply needed to remember his capabilities. Yet, he had never been taught to brush his teeth, had no concept of basic hygiene, and was, for all functional purposes, feral. He slept on a congealed, oily mattress. He didn't own underwear. The dissonance was catastrophic. They were told they were omnipotent spiritual beings, while being treated with less care than livestock. This gap between indoctrinated identity and lived reality didn't inspire greatness. It bred a deep, unshakable shame. If they were truly these powerful beings, why couldn't they change their circumstances? The only logical conclusion, fed by the doctrine, was that they were bad beings. This chapter of Jamie's life reveals the mechanism of control. First, break the connection to the body through neglect. Then, colonize the mind with a belief system that pathologizes normal human needs and emotions. The trillion-year-old God mythos wasn't a spiritual elevation for these kids. It was a weapon used to deny them childhood itself. It justified the lack of schooling, the absence of comfort, and the demand for labor. Their tears weren't met with a hug, but with a theological correction. In this environment, a child's natural desire for love and safety was recast as a spiritual failing. The stage was now set for the ultimate act of commitment, one that would bind them to this system before they could even write their own name. The ultimate expression of this control came at the age of 5, in a moment that should have been simple but was instead profoundly sinister. Jamie was brought downstairs and asked a loaded question. Do you want to support what your mother's doing? For a child who yearned for any shred of parental connection, the answer was an eager, yeah. What followed wasn't a gold star or a hug. He was presented with a document, a billion-year contract pledging his eternal allegiance to L. Ron Hubbard and the Sea Org. Think about the scale of that. A billion years. It's a time frame so vast it becomes meaningless, deliberately so. It's not a commitment for a lifetime. It's a claim on eternity itself. And at that moment, a 5-year-old boy, who had never been to school and couldn't write his own name, was asked to sign it. He couldn't even form letters. So he did the only thing he could. He marked an X on the dotted line, a symbol of his illiteracy and his consent, binding his future to the organization in perpetuity. This wasn't a unique ceremony for Jamie. It was standard practice for children born into the Sea Org. The contract is a cornerstone of Scientology's elite unit, symbolizing the ultimate dedication beyond a single lifetime. But for a child, what does it mean? They can't comprehend the theology, the legal implications, or the millennia-spanning commitment. What they understand is the transaction, approval from a parent, a moment of attention, a feeling of being part of something important. The signing leverages a child's most basic need for love and belonging, twisting it into a tool for institutional enslavement. The X is the perfect metaphor. a placeholder for an identity not yet formed, signed over to a system that plans to dictate every part of its development. The psychological impact of this early commitment is devastating and long-lasting. It creates a deep-seated, internalized debt. You have given your word for 1 billion years. Who are you to complain about hard labor, poor conditions, or a lack of education now? It frames all future dissatisfaction as a personal moral failure, a betrayal of your own sacred oath. For Jamie, this contract hung over every subsequent decision, especially during his teenage years when he felt trapped with no prospects. The billion-year pledge was a psychological anchor, making the outside world seem not like freedom, but like a terrifying breach of contract. It's a promise made under false pretenses to a child who could not possibly understand its terms, yet it wielded the moral weight of a cosmic vow. This chapter in Jamie's story highlights the calculated nature of the system. The neglect and the doctrine prepared the ground, but the billion-year contract was the trapdoor that sealed his fate. It turned a child's natural desire for his mother's love into the mechanism of his own indenture. While Hollywood celebrities might sign similar contracts as adults, making a conscious, if controversial, choice, Jamie's story forces us to confront the reality of children born into this pact. They entered into a billion-year agreement before they could spell the word year. Their first act of commitment was also an act of surrender, and escaping it would later require not just physical flight, but the agonizing process of dismantling a promise that had been woven into the very core of his identity. The theoretical control of doctrine and contract was enforced by a very real, very physical regime of terror. The environment Jamie entered after the nursery was militaristic in the most brutal sense. Muster calls, rigid formations, and a complete lack of supervision created a pressure cooker where older children ruled over younger ones and the adult supervisors cultivated fear as a management tool. But the most chilling aspect of this discipline was its public, ritualistic nature. Punishment wasn't a private correction. It was a theater of pain designed to traumatize both the victim and every child forced to bear witness. Jamie describes a specific, searing memory. If a child did something deemed wrong, they would be dragged on stage. Then, in a grotesque inversion of parental protection, the child's own parent would be ordered to strip them naked and beat them in front of the entire assembly of kids. One such spectacle is burned into Jamie's memory. A young boy, stripped of his clothes, was being hit by his mother. He was squirming, trying to escape the blows, making it difficult for her to hold him. In his desperation, he broke away and ran to the side of the stage. The beating should have stopped. Instead, an adult member of the Sea Org, standing sentry in uniform, stepped forward, grabbed the fleeing child, and dragged him back to his mother so the beating could continue. Imagine the message this sent. There was no refuge. Not in flight, not in the instinct to seek mercy. The institution itself would ensure your punishment was completed. The authority of the parent and the authority of the church merged into a single, terrifying force of compliance. For the children watching, the world narrowed to a simple, horrifying equation. Disobedience equals public shaming and pain, and no one will save you. The psychological impact on the audience of children was as calculated as the beating itself. Jamie recalls that their reaction to witnessing such extreme violence was nervous, hysterical laughter. It was a laugh born of sheer, overwhelming terror, the only release valve available for 5- and 6-year-olds trying to process the unprocessable. This reaction, of course, could then be used against them by the doctrine. Their laughter could be framed as a negative reaction or a lack of empathy, further layering on guilt and shame. The system was creating a closed loop of trauma. Inflict violence, provoke a traumatized response, then pathologize that response as a spiritual failing. It was a method designed to deaden natural empathy, to make cruelty seem normal, and to fracture any potential solidarity among the children. This culture of terror extended beyond stage spectacles into the daily, chaotic violence of a Lord of the Flies environment with no real adult oversight. Jamie recounts an extreme instance where an older teenage commander in a naval uniform, frustrated with a defiant younger boy, grabbed the child's arm and jammed his hand into an exposed electrical socket. Both were electrocuted, huddled together in a deadly embrace. After the shock, the crying stopped. Both boys simply looked at each other, dazed, as if some unspoken limit had been reached. This wasn't just bullying. It was a reflection of the value system they were immersed in, where force was the ultimate solution and suffering was a tool for control. The public beatings and the random electrocution were two sides of the same coin. A comprehensive education in powerlessness, teaching the lost children that their bodies were not their own, and that pain was the primary language of their world. While the doctrine taught them they were eternal spirits, their physical bodies told a different, more desperate story. In the cramped, unsanitary dormitories, childhood illnesses ran unchecked like wildfires. Measles, mumps, hepatitis, and chronic lice swept through the populations of children who were seen not as patients in need of care, but as contagion vectors in need of management. Jamie suffered from perpetual head lice, a condition so severe it would take hours with a steel comb to remove the eggs, leaving his scalp raw and bleeding. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a visible mark of their neglect, a scarlet letter etched in nits and blood. Medical care was virtually non-existent. The concept of a regular doctor's visit, a dental checkup, or even basic first aid was absent from their world. Their bodies, in the eyes of the system, were merely temporary containers for the trillion-year-old thetans inside, containers that weren't worth maintaining. The catastrophic consequences of this invisibility became shockingly clear during Jamie's rare visits to his grandmother in New York. These trips were glimpses into a normal world, and it was there that the full extent of the neglect was violently exposed. During one visit at age 4, his grandmother put him in a bathtub. Her smiling face suddenly turned ashen. She started screaming for Jamie's stepfather. What she had seen was a severe infection in his lower extremities, one that had festered unnoticed for so long it was on the verge of turning septic, a condition that would have killed him. Rushed to the emergency room, Jamie received life-saving treatment for an infection that should have been caught and treated weeks earlier. His own body had been a silent, screaming alarm that no one in his daily life was listening to. The pattern repeated itself 2.5 years later. Jamie complained that he couldn't hear. His mother dismissed it as faking. His grandmother, wary, took him to a friend who was a pediatrician. The doctor looked in his ear and immediately told his grandmother to drive him to Manhattan for emergency surgery. Jamie underwent a tonsillectomy and had his adenoids removed. The resulting conversation with the surgeon was another brutal lesson. The doctor told his family he didn't think Jamie would ever hear normally again. Permanent, preventable damage caused by untreated infection, all because, as Jamie summarizes, no one was looking at my body. His basic sensory connection to the world was damaged because his pain and symptoms were filtered through a doctrine that interpreted them as moral failures, not medical crises. This chapter reveals a fundamental truth of the lost children's existence. They were spiritually hypervisible under the doctrine's intense scrutiny, yet physically invisible in terms of care. A broken tooth from a fall was worn for over a year as a scarlet letter, an exposed nerve pulsing with every breath. Because seeking dental care was unthinkable. Their suffering was constant, but it was a silent, solitary suffering. Illness and injury were not communal tragedies to be solved. They were personal spiritual evidence to be endured. The near-fatal sepsis and the lost hearing are not just medical anecdotes. They are proof of a system that valued ideological purity over the biological reality of the children in its charge. Their small bodies became landscapes of silent evidence, bearing the scars of a philosophy that saw the material world and their place within it as an illusion to be overcome rather than a reality to be nurtured. As the children grew older, their utility to the organization shifted from passive, warehoused beings to active, exploitable labor. The doctrine that framed them as ancient, responsible beings now provided the perfect justification for assigning them dangerous, adult-grade work. There was no transition, no training for a trade. One day, Jamie was simply a kid in a dorm. The next, he was a tool to be deployed. His first major labor task came around age 7. The Sea Org had moved into an old industrial hospital complex, and they needed someone small to clean out the deep, filthy ventilation ducts. Jamie, with his tiny frame, was the perfect candidate. They wrapped him in an oversized hazmat suit, handed him a substance called royal jelly, and sent him into the dark, claustrophobic maze of vents to scrub them out. What was framed as an adventure to a young boy was, in reality, conscripting a child into an industrial cleaning job with unknown chemical and biological hazards. This pattern of deploying children for hazardous tasks continued. Shortly after the vent cleaning, now around 7.5, Jamie was brought to the main building for another project. He was given kitchen gloves and told to pack raw fiberglass insulation into large industrial garbage cans. To a child who had never seen cotton candy, the material seemed innocuous, even magical. He had no reference point for its danger. With no protective mask, no goggles, and only thin gloves, he spent days handling the material, the microscopic glass fibers filling the air he breathed and embedding themselves in his skin and throat. The work was relentless and physically agonizing. At night, he'd return to an empty apartment. His parents worked until 11 p.m. and take scalding hot baths, a ritual to try and release the fiberglass from his pores, feeling the burning sensation as the fibers loosened. The psychological manipulation surrounding this labor was as calculated as the labor itself. These tasks were often introduced not as punishments, but as important missions or even honors. The shift in framing, from an adventure to a torture, mirrored Jamie's own dawning realization of his exploitation. The initial excitement of being given an important job, of feeling useful in a world where he was otherwise ignored, eventually curdled into the understanding that he was being used precisely because he was expendable. An adult would require proper pay, protective equipment, and regulated work hours. A child, already under a billion-year contract and indoctrinated to believe service was his purpose, required none of those things. His body was a resource to be consumed. The physical toll was severe and lingering. The fiberglass in his throat, the chemical exposure in the vents, the sheer exhaustion. These were the occupational hazards of a childhood spent in servitude. It's a stark illustration of the system's hypocrisy. They taught the children they were immortal spiritual beings, yet they treated their physical vessels with a carelessness bordering on contempt. This was not education or apprenticeship. It was the extraction of labor from the most vulnerable members of the group. While other children his age were learning multiplication tables, Jamie was learning how to tolerate burning skin and airborne particulate matter, his education consisting entirely of how to be of use to the organization, one dangerous task at a time for a child living in a world of unrelenting pressure and silent neglect. Any outside attention can feel like a lifeline, even if that attention comes in the form of a chaotic, terrifying FBI raid. When Jamie was about 8 years old, he was abruptly woken at midnight, dragged from his bed in the Fountain Building, and told there was an inspection. He and the other children were herded across the street to the massive Orwellian blue complex known as the Big Blue Building. Inside, a surreal scene unfolded. Men in suits and badges were pouring into the building, while the children were kept awake all night, constantly being moved from room to stairwell to eating area. A human shell game orchestrated to keep them away from the federal agents. To Jamie and the others, the reason for the commotion was a mystery. The atmosphere was one of adult panic and institutional lockdown. Yet, amidst this chaos, the children found a perverse sense of enjoyment. For once, someone was actively paying attention to them. Their movement was being orchestrated. Their presence was a factor to be managed. In the twisted logic of their deprived lives, this felt like care. It was a tragic irony that would only become clear years later. The largest FBI raid in U.S. history at that time, Operation Snow White, targeting Scientology's infiltration of the U.S. government, was unfolding around them, and the most salient detail for these lost children was the novelty of being noticed. The raid, which would uncover troves of documents and lead to the convictions of high-ranking church officials, was, in that moment, just another confusing, sleepless night in a series of many. The documents seized in that raid would have profound consequences, but not for the children. Evidence was found that exonerated a journalist, a Holocaust survivor who had been framed by the church for bomb threats and was facing a decade in federal prison. The raid was a landmark event in the outside world's battle with Scientology, a proof of its criminal reach. But within the walls of the Big Blue Building and its adjacent dormitories, life for Jamie and the other children snapped back to its grim normalcy with startling speed. The suits and badges vanished. The intense, nervous attention ceased. They were once again invisible, their brief stint as central players in a national drama over, leaving them with only the same harsh routines and unaddressed needs. This chapter underscores a heartbreaking truth. Even a historic external intervention, focused on high crimes and espionage, could not pierce the intimate, daily reality of systematic child neglect. The FBI was looking for evidence of infiltration and conspiracy, not for malnourished children with fiberglass in their lungs or untreated infections. The raid changed the legal landscape for the Church of Scientology, but it did not save the lost children. Their rescue would not come from a government operation, but from a far more personal and desperate act, one that would require Jamie, years later, to flee not from federal agents, but from the very people who claimed to hold the key to his eternal salvation. The raid was a dramatic backdrop, but it was not their story. Their story was one of surviving the quiet, relentless aftermath. The breaking point came not with a grand philosophical crisis, but with the dull, repeated threat of a return to punishment. After his torturous stint on Scientology's cruise ship, the Free Winds, where he'd been worked to collapse in the engine room, Jamie had made himself a solemn promise. If they ever tried to send him back, he would run. That test arrived in Florida months later. After a long, sleepless night of fundraising work, he was finally allowed to go to his dormitory at 6 a.m. Just 2 hours later, a furious bang on his door. It was his boss's boss, informing him he had screwed up again. His plane back to the Free Winds for correction left in 2.5 hours. They would be back to collect him in 45 minutes. In that moment, the programmed obedience of a lifetime warred with a newer, raw instinct for survival. The memory of the engine room's heat and the impossible cleaning tasks flashed before him. He knew, with absolute clarity, that returning meant being broken beyond repair. With his window measured in minutes, panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. Moving on pure adrenaline, he gathered everything he owned that wasn't a naval uniform. A few civilian pants, shirts, some socks and underwear, a small stereo, a few CDs. It was the sum total of his worldly possessions. He threw them into a bedsheet, twisted it into a bindle, and slung it over his shoulder, a stark image of a hobo from another era. His plan was simple and desperate. He walked to the communal laundry room to create an alibi, pretending to do wash while watching for one of the rare cabs that sometimes serviced the staff compound. His mind raced through the organization's protocols. He knew they would track any cab he took from the property. He had to be invisible. The moment he saw a cab and felt no eyes upon him, he sprinted. He threw himself into the back seat and gasped a command. "Take me to downtown Tampa. Go." As the car pulled away, the fear of pursuit was a physical taste in his mouth. He was certain they were already calling taxi companies. In downtown Tampa, he paid in cash, got out, and immediately hailed another cab. He repeated this process twice more, changing vehicles 3 times in total, a dizzying evasion tactic to sever any possible trail. Finally, in the 4th cab, he had the driver drop him off at a cluster of hotels in Tampa. He chose a Marriott, walked to the front desk, and with a heart pounding against his ribs, asked a question born of both paranoia and cunning. If he paid cash, did he need to use his real name? The clerk's nonchalant reply, "You can be Mickey Mouse if you want," was his first taste of anonymous freedom. He checked in as Mickey. In the sterile quiet of the hotel room, the enormity of his act settled over him. The first thing he did was peel off the dress whites of his Sea Org uniform, the stiff, symbolic skin of his indenture. He stuffed the uniform and the painfully polished shoes into a trash bag and shoved it down the hotel's garbage chute. He would later describe the sound of it falling away as a 1,000-pound weight lifting off. Then, he collapsed onto the bed and slept for 14 hours, a sleep of such profound exhaustion it felt like a temporary death. When he woke into the unfamiliar darkness of a free man's night, his first call was to the only lifeline he had, his grandmother in New York. He was out, but he was also illiterate, traumatized, and completely unequipped for the world. The physical escape was over. The far more daunting journey of building a mind and a life from scratch was about to begin. The hotel escape was a seismic break from the past, but the future presented a terrifying blank page, literally. Jamie arrived at his grandmother's house in New York, shell-shocked and carrying the deep shame of his illiteracy. His grandmother had once offered him a lifeline years earlier. He could live with her if he was willing to face his illiteracy every day. At the time, the prospect was too daunting, the shame too thick. Now, with nowhere else to go, he had no choice but to accept. The condition was agonizing but necessary. His grandmother, a link to the normal world, became his first patient tutor. He recalls her spending 45 minutes trying to explain the use of a comma to her 19-year-old grandson, a man who had signed a billion-year contract but couldn't construct a simple sentence. The humility of that moment was the foundation of everything that followed. Jamie immediately enrolled in community college remedial classes. The gap between his life experience and his academic skills was a chasm. He could read at a high level from forced doctrine study, but writing was a foreign language. His handwriting was incomprehensible scratches, and paragraphs were a mystery. He attended every tutoring session, fueled by a desperate work ethic forged in the Sea Org. A turning point came when he met a girlfriend who saw his struggle not as a failing, but as a problem to solve. She began by transcribing his papers as he dictated them. Then, she made him start writing them himself, painstakingly correcting his grammar and structure over months. It was a slow, agonizing process of neural rewiring, rebuilding a fundamental human skill from the ground up. Around the same time, he discovered economics. Here was a subject that relied on graphs and logic, not prose. He excelled, intuitively understanding the models. It was his first academic refuge, a place where his mind could work without being betrayed by his pen. His economics professor noticed the discrepancy between his exam performance and his writing. Instead of dismissing him, the professor offered a radical accommodation. Jamie could take his exams verbally in his office. The results confirmed what the professor suspected. Jamie was mastering the material. This act of grace was transformative. The professor became a mentor and sponsor, rallying the college administration behind Jamie. With their support and his patched-together GPA, Jamie applied for a year abroad program at one of the world's most elite institutions, the London School of Economics, LSE. The application process nearly broke him, a crushing exercise in confronting his own limitations. He fell into a depression, convinced it was a futile dream. 6 weeks later, the acceptance letter arrived. It was an almost unimaginable validation, a door swinging open to a realm he was never supposed to enter. Graduating from the London School of Economics was a victory shouted in the world's most esteemed academic arena, but inside, Jamie was still whispering from a place of profound injury. The physical symptoms of a childhood spent in constant fight or flight never left him. He lived in a state of hypervigilance, his nervous system a perpetually tripped alarm, reacting to the present as if it were the past. For years, he avoided therapy, having been programmed to believe psychiatry was evil. It wasn't until the COVID-19 lockdowns, during a period of forced stillness, that he finally sought help and received a diagnosis of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, CPTSD. The diagnosis was a relief, a validation that the tremors within him had a cause, but it was just the map, not the path to healing. The real breakthrough came when he discovered a clinical treatment known as a dual sympathetic reset, or stellate ganglion block, an injection that essentially resets an overactive sympathetic nervous system. The effect, as Jamie describes it, was nothing short of transformative. The constant, crushing physical weight of hyperarousal, the hair-trigger startle response, the insomnia, the sense of being perpetually on guard, simply lifted. For the first time, his body wasn't braced for a threat that was decades old. This physiological peace created the space for deeper creative and emotional work to begin. He had already become, against all odds, a successful art director and writer, hiding his past to avoid being defined by it. Now, armed with this new stability, he turned toward his story with purpose. He wrote a sci-fi graphic novel, Hybrid, a fictionalized version of his life, and the raw, unflinching memoir Child X. He also co-wrote a book on the very treatment that saved him, The Invisible Machine, aiming to bring awareness to a healing modality used for soldiers and first responders. Jamie's mission crystallized into two clear goals. The first is to ensure the story of the lost children is never forgotten. He speaks of the friends he lost to suicide and overdose, the thousands of children on 4 continents who endured the same doctrine of neglect, and the systemic shame that keeps survivors silent. He wants the world to know this was not an accident, but a sustained, decades-long outcome of a specific belief system applied to children. His second, more personal goal is to be seen not as a victim or a survivor, but as an artist and a creator. He doesn't want his trauma to be the lens through which his paintings, designs, or books are viewed. He is a casualty of war who sought and found profound healing, and then used that hard-won peace to build a beautiful, creative life. Today, Jamie's story is ultimately one of staggering triumph, not because of the degrees or the books, but because of the reclamation. He reclaimed his body from panic, his mind from illiteracy, and his future from a billion-year contract. His journey underscores a powerful, universal truth: where you come from does not define what you become. By sharing his story, he gives voice to a generation of silenced children and offers something more vital than outrage: a roadmap for resilience. He stands as proof that even from the deepest darkness, a person can not only escape, but learn to create light, turning a legacy of pain into a purpose fueled by art, advocacy, and hard-won peace.